Okay, this video is called Is Wi-Fi Bad for Your Health? And I'm really combining some other things in here like does Wi-Fi and EMF cause cognitive decline and what can you do to prevent it? And I'll briefly go through a little bit of psychology here in the sense that these are my wrestling coaches at Stanford. These are the Palo Alto foothills where we would run sprints up the hill. There's the Hoover Tower there over at Stanford, the red roofs, the sand tiled bricks of the buildings. Anyways, both of these guys grew up in Palo Alto, California, especially, Mark. This is Dave, and they were the two assistant coaches of wrestling. That's one of the reasons why I went to Stanford, because of these guys. They're both national champions, and at the time I met him, he was kind of fat. It was his off season. We ran sprints on the hills, and he was quite slow. Then we go in the weight room and we lift weights, and he was weak. And I'm like, how does this guy, he's fat, weak, and slow, become a national champion, okay? Usually wrestlers are more built like Mark, kind of muscle bound and real athletic and strong. And I thought that was very impressive, And so the relevance is he used a system I would call incrementalism to make himself great. He was the best wrestler in the whole world. He's like what Bruce Lee was to martial arts. And sort of the question we all face in our own lives is how can we make the most of our own personal situations? We don't have as much money as we want. A lot of times we have to work longer hours than we want. A lot of us, myself, we all wish we had more talent in some area. We wish we were better in some way, but we just have what we have. We have to make the most of it. So here's my point. Being willing to learn is a great talent. And you can learn lots of little things which by themselves seem trivial, but you add them all up and they make a big difference. So what he did that was unique about him, he went to, a little grade school in Palo Alto, and then he would ride his bicycle when he was in junior high over to Palo Alto High School, Pali High. And after high school practice, he would ride his bike over to the university, to the college practice, the Stanford wrestling team. By the time he was a senior in high school, he was the best wrestler in the entire world. He wrestled in the Open National Tournament for the United States, and he defeated the defending national champion from Iowa, Chuck Yagle, caught him on a throw and pinned him. And so what I'm saying is that's incredible for a high school wrestler to pin the defending two-time national champion, most valuable wrestler. Okay, that's an amazing thing. So anyways, the point I'm saying is a person can do much better than they think if they understand what they're doing. What I learned from his brother Mark Schultz was just an intense focus. And I've seen this also, that the way to focus on a problem is like a biblical way, like the Ten Commandments. Thou shalt not eat meat. Thou shalt not do anything that's bad for you that you can avoid doing. Okay, and my own career wasn't so great. My first 2 years, especially wrestling at Stanford. I was a varsity starter above 500, but nowhere near my potential ability. I started hanging around Mark Schultz, and I did way better. That's when I set the school record for winning 39 wins in a year and team captain and et cetera, et cetera. Okay, but anyways, I just show you that thinking biblically. Like, you don't tell an alcoholic you can drink on the weekends. You don't tell a cigarette smoker you can smoke on the weekends. You tell them you never smoke again, you never drink again. You do that, and you get the best possible results. Okay, so here's a picture of Dave Schultz wrestling. And by the way, he's a lot less muscular than the typical world caliber wrestler. But anyways, his approach, it works, and we're going to apply it to health here. And we're also going to do something, I'm going to call this the Fabian strategy, from Quintus Fabius Maximus here, the Roman general. This was Hannibal. Hannibal was the great Carthaginian general, and they were kicking the butt off the Romans, battle after battle. He killed many, many, many thousands of Romans in ancient Rome. These were all their rings. They would take their rings off their finger, and he had, these vases all full of rings from the Romans that his army had conquered. And all the Romans were scared of Hannibal. And then finally this one guy, Quintus Fabius Maximus, said, let me take a try at it. I have a strategy I think will work. Hannibal was far from home, and his supply lines were quite extended, so Fabius just focused on, blocking his supply lines. And he would not get into open confrontation with Hannibal because, Hannibal would kick his butt. But he was able to sort of deplete Hannibal's supply lines, and eventually the Romans were able to defeat Hannibal. Okay, so that's called the Fabian strategy. And something similar was used to great effect by the Russians against Napoleon. So Napoleon was a badass, leader of the French around 1800. Beautiful painting here by Jacques-Louis David. Okay, and here's another one. So Napoleon marches into Russia with like over 500,000 men. And, Napoleon said an army marches on a stomach, and he just figured they would eat along the way from, stealing food from the peasants and the local farms. But the Russians just burned everything. So there was nothing for them to eat. Okay, and his troops were starving, and they had to retreat, and they got picked off during their retreat. So he only ended up, coming home with about 15,000 men. This magnificent painting here, Napoleon in Retreat by Meissonier, from France, the French artist. He's great. So anyways, what you want to try to do is do that to the pathological forces that are trying to make you sick. I could have included the painting there of, Adam and Eve. Live like Adam and Eve, but keep your indoor heating and plumbing. Okay, so anyways, here's what it's going to come down. It's going to come down to this calcium channel on a nerve. Okay, so this is a cell in your brain. Brain cells are called neurons. The ones that communicate. And this is the cell body where the nucleus is, where the DNA is. This is our dendrites. They take incoming information to the neuron. If it's activated, it'll fire an action potential. It'll begin right around here called the axon hillock. And that axon potential, like an electrical current, is transmitted down the axon until it reaches the synaptic terminal where the neuron dilates right here. And once it reaches the synaptic terminal, this is a voltage-gated calcium channel. You need to know that. Voltage-gated calcium channel. Once that's activated, it will open up, calcium enters the cell. The increased calcium entering the cell into the cytoplasm is a signal that these neurotransmitters, they're stored in vesicles, that the vesicles should move up to the synaptic junction here and merge with the plasma membrane, release its neurotransmitter that's going to diffuse across the synaptic clefts and exert an effect upon the postsynaptic neuron. Okay, but the key point is the voltage-gated calcium channel got activated to let calcium come into the neuron. You need to know that. Okay, and then, anytime calcium comes into the neuron and is elevated significantly in the cytoplasm, that will lead to the cell doing whatever that cell mainly does. So in a neuron, that's to release a neurotransmitter. If it were in a smooth muscle, like around your arteries, to constrict them to cause hypertension, it would do that. Okay, but for our purposes, it's going to cause neurotransmitter release. Now, you get a transient increase in cytoplasm calcium, and the neuron does whatever it's going to do, release its neurotransmitter. However, you want to then shut that down real fast. You have to pump that calcium out of a neuron. One of the big ways to pump it out is through what's called the NACA exchanger. NACA is Na for sodium, Ca for calcium. And then it's an exchanger, and it spins like a water wheel, very rapidly pumping out calcium, thousands of them per second, okay? And, where does it get the power to do that? Because it's coupled to a gradient produced by the potassium sodium ATPase. All right, more positive charges are pumped out than in, such that you get a net negative charge inside the cell. So that's an electrical gradient. You also have a concentration gradient of sodium. It's 10 times higher outside the cell than inside the cell. And so you can couple allowing the entry of sodium into the cell to the expulsion of the calcium. Okay, so this is called secondary active transport. Active transport means you had to use an ATP to make this pump work. Whenever you pump against a gradient, you're probably going to be using an ATP or some form of coupled active transport. Okay, calcium has an incredibly high concentration outside the cell. It's about 15,000 times higher than what it is inside the cell. And that's why you always need ATP to pump against that calcium gradient. All right, so that's going to be relevant too, that we need ATP to run this pump. And by the way, 2/3 of the energy of a neuron goes to this pump. It's like the most important thing in a neuron for getting work done is to establish a gradient based on using this pump. So you need to know that as well. When a cell can't make ATP, you can't run this pump and everything just goes downhill. And the neuron's probably going to die. Okay, so we got that. This is the potassium sodium ATPase, and the energy of its gradient is coupled to the NACA exchanger, which is used to pump out calcium. That's how cells work. That's how they get stuff done. And neurons need this more than anything else. A regular cell uses about 1/3 of its energy for this pump, whereas a neuron uses 2/3 of its energy for this pump. Okay, one other set of receptors we need to know about is we need to know about the glutamate receptors and the glutamate ion channels, okay? So the key thing for our purposes is to know that glutamate will bind to this receptor here called the NMDA receptor. And normally magnesium sits in the center of the NMDA receptor and blocks it. Okay, it's also a 2+ cation, meaning positively charged, and it'll be attracted to the negative charge inside the cell, inside the neuron. But when this gradually gets depolarized by the sodium channel adjacent to it, then the magnesium pops out, and now calcium can come through. So glutamate, the most common neurotransmitter in the brain, about 80% of brain neurotransmitters, binds to NMDA. The channel opens up, and then calcium comes in. Okay, you're going to need to know that NMDA channel is important, and it's activated by glutamate. That you need to know. All right, and then that can cause a whole sequence of effects. We'll talk about that some other time. And I've done several lectures on glutamate, excitotoxins, and calcium signaling and whatnot. Okay, the next thing we need to know is the typical neurotransmitter here is glutamate. Glutamate, like we said, when calcium comes into the cell here, let's say like we showed it on our previous drawing, it'll activate the glutamate vesicles to merge with the plasma membrane here, release glutamate across the synapse. And the key thing we need to know is it's then going to activate the postsynaptic neuron, and that's going to get increased cytoplasm calcium. That's all we need to know for our points. It's going to cause increased activity in this postsynaptic neuron. If you overdo the activity, you can overwhelm the postsynaptic neuron, like if there's an unnatural amount of increased glutamate being transmitted. All right, so now here's like kind of the key slide from this whole talk is just remember that when calcium in cytoplasm goes up, things happen. And if you have unnatural pathological elevation of this calcium, then you will damage the cell. So we've given previous lectures recently about how EMF, electromagnetic fields, will cause opening of the voltage-gated calcium channels. It has a voltage sensor on it that's distorted by these abnormal magnetic fields, especially if they're pulsed. And that could be your cell phone, it could be your cell towers, it could be Wi-Fi. Wi-Fi transmission is also pulsed. Bluetooth, smart meters, wireless mouse and keyboard. Okay, and you can't always avoid these. You probably work somewhere where you can't avoid it. You know, we have to travel in areas with Wi-Fi. That's just life. But you could minimize it in your own house, and it's wise to do that. Okay, so you got opening of your voltage-gated calcium channels leading to increased cytoplasm calcium. You also have all these excitotoxins, things like caffeine, MSG, manufactured free glutamate, MFG, aspartame. Some psychiatric drugs will cause this effect. Psychological stress equivalents like sleep deprivation, a lack of magnesium because then you can't block the NMDA receptor as effectively. Like I just showed, it'll bounce out of there. You want to have more magnesium, which you get from eating plant foods, of course. Corticosteroid medications. One thing, it was brought to my attention by one of the viewers of my videos recently that there's some, neurology doctors saying that caffeine's good for the brain, and my advice to them would be open a book and start reading, okay? And also my viewer said that the other neurology doctor said, oh, caffeine's good for the brain, and that they've read papers saying it's good for the brain. You know what I would say? You can't just read papers like an idiot, okay? You have to use your brain. Anything that's popular is going to, especially in the last 20 years, is going to have tons and tons of fake papers that just say it's good. Caffeine and coffee, they're going to promote their product. Soy and all kinds of other foods. You know what I'm talking about. They're always going to say they're good. Tea and all this other stuff. So what I'm saying is caffeine, just ask yourself, what does it do? It increases the same hormones that stress does, meaning that it increases the catecholamine, so it's going to raise your blood pressure. It's going to increase your blood lipids, things you don't want to have happen. It's going to increase your heart rate, thing you don't want to have happen unless you're about to exercise. It's also going to increase cortisol, which is going to increase glutamate travel across those synapses in your brain. So it's going to increase the activity of the postsynaptic neuron. It's going to open up the NMDA receptor we just showed because of the glutamate, and that's going to cause increased cytoplasm calcium. Cortisol also is like a seesaw with melatonin, so you're going to have less ability to sleep. So all of these things are very significantly bad for health. It's an excitotoxin, increasing glutamate transmission. It's also a vasoconstrictor, decreasing blood supply to the brain. Okay, so that is bad for your brain, and there's nothing ambiguous about it. In order to be, a real intelligent doctor, you have to also know when you cannot trust the papers, when they're industry funded. And you have to use your common sense because it's not immediately obvious a lot of times, all right? So you look at the old papers, you look at what does the substance basically do. All right, so anyways, these are excitotoxins. They're going to open up NMDA, and they're going to increase calcium in the cytoplasm. All right, the next point you got other things that are going to deplete the ability of that neuron to make ATP. For example, mitochondrial inhibitors. That's bad, because if you can't make ATP, you can't run that potassium-sodium ATP pump, all right? You can't establish the gradient, meaning that you won't be able to use your NACA exchanger. You won't be able to pump out the calcium from your cytoplasm, and the cell will eventually be screwed if that continues, okay? So if you eat excessive amounts of dietary sodium, that's also going to dissipate the gradient. I've given lectures about that before, but the bottom line, it's unhealthy. Now you say to yourself, well, why don't people just die all of a sudden if they eat tons of salt, or if they use their cell phone all the time, or if they drink lots of caffeine? And the reason is the human body is very good at healing itself, and it does everything it can to compensate for all the unhealthy behaviors we do and eat and whatnot. But you don't want to push your luck, or you end up like with, the last straw that broke the camel's back. You tip over a threshold and you start losing brain cells and eventually becoming cognitively impaired or cognitively slow, stupid compared to what you used to be. I think many of us has noticed that we're not quite as smart as we were in college. In college, we were ignoramuses. We didn't have much information in our brains, but we could do our math problems faster than we can do them now. All right, but be that as it may, the next thing is your SERCA inhibitor. SERCA inhibitors is a sarcoplasm, endoplasmic reticulum, calcium ATPase, and that's the pump that pumps the calcium out of the cytoplasm into the endoplasmic reticulum. It's real important, and there's a lot of things that inhibit it. You can just think of anything that smells bad, and a lot of preservatives inhibit SERCA. Okay, when you have mitochondrial inhibitors, those mitochondrial inhibitors will also lead to quite often more superoxide anions leaking off the electron transport chain. And so that's going to produce superoxide here. It's drawn as a free radical. That's what the little dot is, an unpaired electron in its outer orbital. All right, well, anyways, we'll come back to that in a moment. But increased cytoplasm calcium is going to increase activation of this enzyme called calmodulin. It binds to calcium, so it's called the calcium calmodulin enzyme. And that's going to activate two types of nitric oxide synthase. So that's the enzyme that makes nitric oxide. So the first one is nitric oxide 3. It's also endothelial nitric oxide. So the E is got 3 little dots on it, so that's how you can remember it's number 3. The reason it has a numerical name as well as sort of a location name is that it's in more things than just endothelial cells. Okay, and this is nNOS. This is the neuronal nitric oxide synthase. It's number 1. You can remember it's number 1 because there's one letter before it. That's a good way to do it. Okay, and the whole point of this, nitric oxide synthase will make nitric oxide. And we always think of nitric oxide as being a good thing, and for the most part it is. So the type of nitric oxide you get from eating greens. Remember Dr. Esselson's lecture about this, Nathan Bryant's lecture about this, and Beth Shirley lectures a lot about this. That's a good thing. So the nitrates from the salad that you eat, like arugula in particular, but they all got some nitrates in them. As far as I'm aware, you'll get mouth bacteria converted to nitrite, NO2. It starts out as NO3 nitrate, and then your stomach acid converts to nitric oxide and it goes into your blood. It has a systemic vasodilatory effect. You will also get nitric oxide released from sunshine. So just getting sunshine will cause nitric oxide stores release of that into your blood as well. All right, but what's the point? What's the problem? There's certain things that can uncouple your nitric oxide synthase and lead to production of superoxide. The enzyme will make either one. If it's uncoupled, if you got, for example, a depletion of BH4. We'll get into that later, what all that stuff is in uncoupling, because that's sort of another topic. I don't want to get into that right now. But also, if you have mitochondrial dysfunction, for any of these reasons, you're going to have more superoxide anions around. Those will very quickly combine with the nitric oxide, and now it becomes something bad. It'll become what's called peroxynitrite. And that's bad, okay? And that will damage your mitochondria even more, lead to pain, fatigue, cell death, loss of neurons, and you become stupid, okay? All right, so I'm giving you the overview. Now we're going to go through a paper. Well, I'll show you 1 or 2 more slides. This is Esselston. Esselston talking about he wants people eating greens all day long, especially the really sick patients who are high risk, okay? Oh, this was just showing the pathway. The nitrites, NO3, go into your mouth. The bacteria in the back of the tongue convert them to nitrites. That should be NO2. Okay, well, this should be nitrite. And then it goes in the stomach, and you absorb the nitric oxide. You don't want to be using these things in your mouth because they'll block it. Okay. Sunshine gives you more nitric oxide. It also helps you maintain your endothelial glycocalyx, the coating of your cells, your arterial lining. Okay, but here's the big point. Here's the paper. This paper was written by an author named Martin Pall. P-A-L-L is his last name. And he says Wi-Fi is an important problem for human health. Okay? And he goes through the fact that there's been tons and tons of papers written showing that Wi-Fi is bad for you. This is not like some mystery. The reason why you probably never heard of this is this type of knowledge almost never gets to the public. Okay? And the three most sensitive organs in the body are the brain, because it's got the highest concentration of voltage-gated calcium channels. But also the heart is vulnerable to problems from this, and so are the testicles. Okay, there's other parts of the body too, but those are the three that come to mind immediately. So this can cause a major decrease in male fertility. It can drop male sperm counts as much as 50%. Okay, well, it's not necessarily all due to Wi-Fi. The point of this little line here is he's saying that there are declines in many advanced technology countries of over 50% in male sperm production. So the amount that's due to Wi-Fi, I'm not sure of the exact amount, okay? But there's multiple studies showing that it decreases sperm. And so you can see there's a lot of things happening to sterilize men. Think about it. There is the soy, is bad for male reproduction. F- is bad for male sperm production, okay? All those endocrine disrupting chemicals that are estrogenic, like the GP glyphosate is bad for male sperm production. Okay, so there's a lot of things working against a guy having a high testosterone, and I think that might be part of the incredible increase in feminization of men in the last 40, 50 years. I can tell you, men were much more macho when I was young than they are now. You go on TV, man, it was all this Chuck Connors, there was, all these macho men heroes. Maybe 5 minutes. Okay, so, anyways, let's see, the next thing here, let me go to the next slide now. The balls, the brains, and the heart are the key things affected by Wi-Fi. Wi-Fi is also worse than EMF from a lot of other sources because it's pulsed. When it's pulsed, it has a bigger biological effect. They found that when mice were continually exposed to EMF, they had a dramatic drop in fertility, and you could eventually sterilize them. Okay. Wi-Fi is especially damaging to young people. Their skulls are not as thick, their blood-brain barrier is not as well developed, and they don't fully develop their skull until they become, they start going through their puberty and whatnot. So what I'm trying to say is, doesn't it sound kind of insane to have Wi-Fi in all the schools? And isn't it kind of insane the way people accept everything and just, oh yeah, sure, put Wi-Fi in the school, and people put it in their homes? Because in my opinion, they're dumbasses. Okay, and I can tell you, I have seen this problem with lots of people. I can tell you what I always get told. Oh, you're not normal. Everybody needs Wi-Fi. You have to put Wi-Fi everywhere. No, you don't. There was internet. I remember when the internet first came around. Stuff was hardwired everywhere, okay? I mean, I don't know for sure exactly when Wi-Fi started, but people did just fine with hardwired computers, okay? And people did just fine before they had cell phones. All right. It really does seem insane, something that dramatically lowers testicular function. It also lowers female fertility as well. Let's see what else. You could block the effects with calcium channel blockers, the drugs, which is another indicator that its main mechanism of having a biological effect is through these voltage-gated calcium channels. And it wasn't just the L-type, it was other types of voltage-gated calcium channels too, for what that's worth, in case somebody actually cares about that. All right, what are some key points here? The brain has the highest density of voltage-gated calcium channels, so it's more vulnerable to some of these effects. They're associated with decreased ability to sleep, increased fatigue. And anything that makes you sleep less is potentially quite bad for your brain, because your brain cleans itself at night while you're asleep with the glymphatic system. I did a previous video about how I have my bed set up to avoid EMF at night. You want to make your bedroom kind of like an EMF sanctuary. A lot of expert people even recommend having a battery operated alarm clock, not even plug it in your alarm clock, getting rid of all electronics from your bedroom. You never want a TV or computer and all that other stuff in your bedroom if you can avoid it. If you have to have it in there, unplug it at night. Okay, association with the oxidative stress. We'll talk about that in a future lecture. That's a little bit complicated, but it also lowers female fertility. All right. It does more bad things, but that's the main point, what I just talked about. Okay, and then here's again kind of showing you a good way to think of it. Anything that's increasing cytoplasm calcium, that's bad for you. And the big things that you have easy control of is avoiding all these excitotoxins, caffeine, MSG. And the way to avoid caffeine is don't drink anything with caffeine in it. No coffee, no tea, no energy drinks. MSG, avoid processed food. It's in almost every processed food. It's even in organic foods, okay? If they're processed, if they got more than one ingredient, there's a good chance it's in there. There's aspartame stuff. Manage your stress, get your sleep. Okay, EMF, all this stuff. Avoid it to the extent you can. We'll talk about that in different lectures, but talk about the nighttime sanctuary. Do you really need your cell phone? Don't carry it right on your body, etc. If you have a choice for your house, hardwire everything instead of Wi-Fi. Hypoxia, that's sort of like dilatory stuff. Mitochondria inhibitors. I gave a lecture on mitochondria inhibitors recently. There's 0 of them shown in the standard college and medical school textbooks. But when I just go on the internet and I start reading about mitochondria inhibitors, I very quickly found 44 of them, okay? And about 30 of those are common. That's what I mean by medical school textbooks are a joke. They almost contain 0 clinically useful information. They're so bad, it's unbelievable. Okay, let's see what else is interesting on here. And you can increase your nitric oxide, the good nitric oxide, by eating your greens every day, getting your sunshine, okay? All right, and that's the end for this. So the conclusion was, yes, Wi-Fi is bad for your health, but it's really just one more thing out of about 70 different things that are bad for your brain. So minimize your exposure to it to the extent that you can.